A life remembered. Mourners pay their respects as former President George H.W. Bush lies in state in the U.S. Capitol. U.S. foreign policy. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defends the Trump administration and names 3 countries undermining global peace. Aid to Syria. What Pope Francis is doing to support Christians suffering due to the bloody civil war. And Sultan of Sand. We'll tell you about the Vatican's Nativity scene and its ties to the state of Florida. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, December 4th, 2018.
His example will always inspire, and his lifetime of service will be enshrined in the hearts of the American people forever.
Honoring the life and legacy of George H.W. Bush, dignitaries and everyday Americans gathered to pay their respects to the former president who died Friday evening. He was 94. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Mourners flock to Capitol Hill. The casket of the former president, George H.W. Bush, now rests atop a platform made to support the remains of Abraham Lincoln. President Trump and the First Lady were among the mourners who visited last night. Correspondent Mark Irons is on Capitol Hill.
Good evening, Lauren. This morning I joined Americans from as far away as California waiting in line to say goodbye to George H.W. Bush. People of all ages, backgrounds, brought together by one man who served the nation through a long life of public service.
Honor him for honoring us.
In 1988, the Bolins met then Vice President George H.W. Bush on the campaign trail. Their 7-year-old daughter, Kate, was battling leukemia, the same disease that took the life of Bush's daughter, Robin. He took a moment to speak with Kate.
Got down on his knees, face to face, eyeball to eyeball with her, to step away from the power brokers of the world, to spend time with the little girl. It just speaks to his heart.
Kate would pass away 2 years later. The Bolins always remembering the consideration Bush showed.
We appreciate that.
We joined the growing line of mourners of all political stripes.
Well, and this was the first man I voted for.
Steve McKinney turned 18 in 1992. He comes from a military family and stuck with Bush as a kid.
But I had a Bush Quail 88 sticker on my junior high locker and a Bush Quail 92 on my high school locker.
A couple vacationing from Los Angeles didn't support his policies, but came here to honor him.
I mean, we're Americans, and he was our president, so we think that deserves respect.
Elementary school students in line described the moment.
Once in a lifetime.
This school group from Maryland, on a field trip to the National Gallery of Art, took a detour to the Capitol building.
It's special for me.
It's a very sad occasion, but also very cool because I've never had an opportunity like this.
The body of George H.W. Bush brought to the Capitol last night for the honor of lying in state. Lawmakers of both parties paid their respects, and the vice president spoke on behalf of his family and of President Trump.
On behalf of the First Family and my family and the American people, we offer our deepest sympathies and respects to your family. And we thank you for sharing this special man with our nation and the world.
The President and First Lady visited later in the evening. President Trump honored his predecessor with a salute.
In a statement, the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, is offering prayers for the repose of the soul of the former president. He called Bush a courageous man, dedicated leader, and selfless public servant. Lauren?
Mark, what an amazing report, all the people you saw in those lines. What are the funeral plans for the former president tomorrow?
Well, the people in those lines, the public will be allowed into the Capitol Rotunda around the clock until tomorrow morning. Now, that's when the casket leaves Capitol Hill. The former president was Episcopalian, and funeral services will be held at the National Cathedral here in Washington tomorrow. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons, rarely on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Mark. Our coverage of the life and legacy continues later in the show. We'll look back And with the Hill's Bob Cusack about the former president's bipartisanship and how it helped his political success. As business comes to a standstill at the Capitol, congressional leaders introduce a 2-week funding bill to avert a partial government shutdown. The stopgap measure would keep the government funded through December 21st, 2 weeks after a Friday deadline. The House and Senate are expected to pass the measure this week. We may learn more about the special counsel's Russia investigation. Robert Mueller is set to give the first public insight into how much cooperation he has received from the president's former national security advisor. Lawyers have until midnight to recommend a sentence for Michael Flynn. The former U.S. Army Lieutenant General pleaded guilty to lying about the FBI, about his contacts with Moscow. The filing also may give insight into the direction of the probe into possible collusion with Russia. 11 Catholic priests in Pennsylvania win their appeal before the state's Supreme Court. They were suing to keep their names out of the landmark grand jury report on clergy sex abuse. The priests deny the allegations and say they were not given a chance to defend themselves. Police in Ukraine searched the homes of Russian Orthodox priests. It's part of a criminal investigation into incitement of hatred and violence. The Orthodox Church in Ukraine is seeking independence after centuries of being under the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church. America's top diplomat is staunchly defending the Trump administration's foreign policy. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. is building a new democratic order aimed at stopping bad actors like China, Russia, and Iran. But not all of America's allies agree with the president's policy. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee has more from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary Pompeo is in Brussels to meet with NATO allies. He says the Trump administration is asking whether the world's top international organizations really work or if there's need for reform. Pompeo says the U.S. will continue to call them out.
We aspire to make the international order serve our citizens, not to control them.
Secretary Mike Pompeo delivering a wide-ranging speech at NATO. He cites the importance of international cooperation, but criticizes the United Nations.
Today, at the United Nations, peacekeeping missions drag on for decades, no closer to peace. The UN's climate-related treaties are viewed by some nations as simply a vehicle to redistribute wealth.
Pompeo didn't limit his critiques to the UN. He also blamed the European Union, the Organization of American States, and the African Union. Brett Schaefer, an expert in foreign affairs, says Pompeo is doing his duty.
Being a large financial contributor, if not the largest in all of these organizations, puts a special responsibility on us. If we don't challenge the organization to meet its core mandate and hold it responsible for fulfilling its missions and responsibilities, who will?
Schaefer also praises Pompeo for calling out Russia, Iran, and China as bad actors who have not been held accountable for violating international treaties.
Words should mean something. Our administration is thus lawfully exiting or renegotiating outdated or harmful treaties, trade agreements, and other international arrangements that do not serve our sovereign interests or the interests of our allies.
Some European allies are pushing back against Pompeo. Critics say President Trump's approach includes too much aggressive rhetoric. Secretary Pompeo says specifically the European Union has not held Iran accountable for their support and funding of terrorism. He also highlighted today China's numerous human rights violations. Lauren?
Why China does not allow Christians to openly practice their faith, and often China wants to control churches. Is the State Department addressing the issue of religious liberty there?
Pompeo and other members of the State Department are aware of the persecution of religious and ethnic minorities. Pompeo says China is guilty of what he called today Orwellian human rights violations. One example has been the censoring of Bibles. But also in recent years, China's government has banned tens of thousands of churches, either by cutting off electricity and water or just downright demolishing them. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Mexico's newly inaugurated president hits the ground running with a pledge to govern as a common man.
Y es un gobierno para darle seguridad.
In his first press conference yesterday, Andrés Manuel López Obrador promised to end decades of secrecy and luxury enjoyed by past presidents. He created a commission to investigate the 2014 disappearance of 43 students in an apparent massacre. He also says he'll hold news conferences on a nearly daily basis. British Prime Minister Theresa May is on a collision course with Parliament over her Brexit plan. Lawmakers today begin debate over the proposal for Britain to leave the European Union. A vote is set for December 11th. It appears likely Parliament will reject May's suggestion. After days of unrest, France says it will suspend a fuel tax increase. The decision did little to appease protesters. In Marseille, high school students clashed with police. Demonstrators say the government's decision is just the first step, and they vow to keep fighting. The planned increases will be delayed until the summer. The prime minister says no tax is worth putting the nation's unity in danger. Fishermen in Indonesia rescue 20 Rohingya Muslims. The group of men and boys were discovered nearly 2 miles off the coast. They were brought ashore and placed in a Navy shelter while Indonesian immigration officials tried to identify them. It is not clear where the group traveled from or where they were headed. Earlier this week, Pope Francis launched a global campaign calling for peace in Syria.
Preghiamo e aiutiamo I cristiani a rimanere in Siria.
Before a massive crowd packed into St. Peter's Square, the Holy Father lit a candle and prayed for Christians in the country. The bloody civil war in Syria has lasted for nearly 8 years. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, tell us about the campaign the Holy Father kicked off on Sunday.
Lauren, the Pope is asking the world to pray for the thousands of men, women, and children in Syria who are suffering as a result of this civil war. The conflict there began, as we know, in 2011 and is still raging. The government led by President Bashar al-Assad is fighting with opposition forces who want him removed. Now, the prayer campaign is being sponsored by the group Aid to the Church in Need, and that Catholic organization says that it involves over 50,000 children of different religions from war-torn cities in Syria. Now, as we know, more than 400,000 people have died in the conflict, according to estimates.
Boy, those numbers are just staggering. St. Paul had his famous conversion on the road to Damascus, and the disciples of Jesus were first called Christians in Syria. Give us a sketch of the Christian community there.
Lauren, as you said, Christians have very deep roots in the country, and their communities are ancient. About 100 years ago, Christians made up as much as 25% of the population, and now they make up only about 10%. Christians have fled in large numbers due to the bloody civil war, and according to the UN, more than 5 million Syrians are refugees. Now, through this campaign, the goal of Aid to the Church in Need is to send $17 million to help Christians who remain in the country.
5 million refugees, Juliet. So what is the Pope's solution to this?
Lauren, the Holy Father says we must pray for the Christians there and help them to stay in their country. Church officials in the Middle East say we must help their communities thrive in their native lands rather than helping them flee to the West. Many say that Christians are the ones who can play a key role in keeping peace in the region, and it'll be a great loss if they're forced to abandon their ancient communities. Pope Francis calls Christians in the Middle East witnesses of mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And he's also calling those who foment war and make arms for conflicts to a conversion of heart.
Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Coming up, a veteran Washington journalist examines the bipartisan legacy of former President George H.W. Bush. As the nation continues to remember the life of former President George H.W. Bush, USA Today says he left both a liberal and conservative legacy on the Supreme Court. He nominated 2 justices, David Souter, who the article says is one of the most liberal judges ever nominated by a Republican. He defended the right of women to have an abortion and retired in 2009. The second pick was Clarence Thomas, who is a pro-life supporter and a practicing Catholic. Joining me now is Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief for The Hill. Bob, welcome back to our broadcast.
Hey, Lauren.
We're on the eve of this day of mourning. We look back at the legacy. I'd love your thoughts on the tributes you have seen to date. Vice President Pence Paul Ryan.
I think that Bush, I mean, it's hard to encapsulate him in just one sentence, and certainly a one-term.
It's not prudent.
No, it wouldn't be prudent. But I do think he was respected on both sides of the aisle. I do think it was remarkable that he and President Clinton formed this bond, this friendship. I mean, I've talked to House members who they'll never talk to the candidate they lost to or beat. I mean, there's just so much animosity there. And here they ran for president and then did some great works for charity. You know, I think generally, now he's a tough politician, and he went after Dukakis and that kind of thing. So you have to be tough to succeed in politics. So, but I do think he was a respected and revered figure.
You mentioned Dukakis. There are other instances in which Politico is referencing and saying, is history being too kind to George H.W. Bush? And they mentioned the racially charged Willie Horton ad that questioned Dukakis' toughness on crime.
Yeah.
He questioned the patriotism of Bill Clinton during that election. I'll ask you the same question. Is history being too kind to him?
I think maybe yes, but I think that's a good thing. I think when we pass, I think we should remember the good things. We're human. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say things probably that we regret. And that's why politicians are a lot more popular out of office than they are in of office. So I think it's good for humanity to say, let's remember the good things, not all the mistakes. But I think you should mention the mistakes or the things that maybe he would have taken back.
That's such a good point. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, after she left, her ratings were up, and
Went
then
way up.
She gets back into the political game and zoom, right down.
That's exactly right.
What can politicians of today learn from him, from George H.W. Bush, about bridging divides based on his talent for building relationships?
Well, I think it's such a different era that I don't think that politicians today are going to learn much from it. I just don't. I mean, I just think that the deals that they struck, even in the 1990s on the Balanced Budget Act, Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress, and the deals that Bush struck, especially on no new taxes, and he agreed to raise taxes, where he flip-flopped, and it hurt him in his re-election bid. I think those big deals are something of the past, and we're not going to see them, at least in the immediate future.
His service tomorrow is going to bring together current presidents, his predecessor. We talk about the new civility in Washington. Could there be a new civility in Washington? And the answer is always no. So I'll ask it again. Could there be a new civility in Washington because of this funeral that's bringing people together? Or after that, will the lights flip and it'll be business as usual?
I think it's going to be business as usual.
Of course it is.
Yes, I hate to disappoint.
I know.
I just think you see these things, whether it's political violence, Steve Scalise getting shot, Gabby Giffords, and now things are going to change. Unfortunately, they haven't changed, and I think it's going to continue. But at least for a few moments, that we're not fighting over the political fight of the day, the border wall, that we're giving tribute to someone who's really a great man.
Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief for The Hill, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, Catholic alternatives to health care, and why this Florida man is playing in the sand at the Vatican. Last week, EWTN won its court case against the Obama administration's contraceptive mandate. The rule required companies to cover contraception, sterilization, and abortion-inducing drugs in their health plans. The battle took nearly 7 years, but for many, the fight continues. Joining me now are Chris Faddis and Brad Hahn, co-founders of Solidarity Health Share, and that's a sharing ministry that offers members an affordable and ethical way to pay for health care. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Why are you here talking about the individual mandate? There must be a difference between the individual mandate and the employer mandate.
Yeah, with the individual mandate, there's still, we're forced to buy insurance that violates our conscience. So we're still forced to go to the exchange and pay for things we find morally objectionable, like contraception, sterilization, abortion-inducing drugs. And so that's why we're here in Congress today, to try to fight for those protections.
Two pro-life research organizations, the Family Research Council, the Charlotte Lozier Institute, have released their review of elective abortion coverage under Obamacare. It shows an increase in taxpayer-funded abortions in Obamacare compliant plans for next year. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, I think that with the federal government zeroing out the fine, there's been this effort at the state level to try to increase availability for abortion in these plans. And so we're seeing the kind of the alter attack of trying to increase that. We're also seeing that members, it's hard to find out if your plan that you're buying actually includes abortion. So really for folks that are out there trying to shop around, they can't even find out if they're going to be paying for it or not.
So at Solidarity Health Share, let's just give an understanding to our audience about how it works. You have about 6,000 members, everybody pays in, and then what happens?
Yeah, so the big picture, we're an advocate for our members. And so I'll just give you an example how it works is we had a member early on, and she had breast cancer, and she had that gene that was predisposed to breast cancer in the future. So after radiation chemo, she had to get a double mastectomy. Well, she received over 600 bills, and it amounted to over $400,000 in medical bills.
Ow.
Could you imagine trying to raise kids? She has 4 kids, trying to raise kids and trying to deal with that mess. So we step in as an advocate for our members. So we took those 600 bills, analyzed them, and we are able to get those bills repriced down to under $200,000.
This is all, though, based on the social and moral doctrine, teaching of the Catholic Church. So when people come to your program, they know what?
They know we're going to respect their conscience, we're going to fight for their conscience, and make sure that the plan will never include things that would be objectionable. We're also going to keep their costs low. There's been a 275% increase in premiums since the Affordable Care Act came into play, and we keep their costs down well below that. And then also that we're going to share those expenses among this community of members that care about each other, pray for one another in their healthcare needs.
And there's no profit.
There's no profit. It's a not-for-profit organization. Yeah.
And so that money comes in and it just continues to roll over to pay for this group's medical insurance.
Correct.
Medical
Yes.
coverage.
Yeah. Their medical needs, correct.
Right. Does your plan cover out of wedlock pregnancies? Couldn't a lack of coverage encourage women to choose abortion?
Well, see, we don't use the term coverage because we're not insurance, so it's an eligible medical expense. But we do share in out-of-wedlock expenses like that. The reason being is because, we have teenagers, and you never know what happens. And we want to be there when our families, a family of our members are going through a crisis like that. We want to be there to support them, not only financially, but also emotionally, and get the right help they need.
In order to choose life.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
A lot of other plans don't do what you're doing here. You're the only plan that actually covers that. How do I say it if you're not insurance? Shares these things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We share in all eligible pregnancy expenses, and the delivery, the birth, the labor, as well. One of the things that Solidarity is different than the other healthcare sharing ministries is that we actually share in mental health, because again, we don't know what's going to happen to our family members. We have a very faithful Catholic family. One of their sons is suicidal. We have to support that family, and so we share in mental health as well.
Great to have you guys on the program, an affordable alternative to Obamacare. And one of the reasons we have you here today is that they're at the halfway point of enrollment. I think they actually have 11 days left for that Obamacare enrollment. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes,
Thanks for having us.
Finally, tonight, the designer of the Vatican's Nativity scene this year says the experience has made a huge impact on him.
Apart from what I knew of the Vatican, the history, reading books and seeing pictures, I was quite astounded by the impact of all the grandeur and, of course, the spirituality of the place. It's quite humbling and bringing me back to a center, I guess.
Richard Verano, a native of New Smyrna, Florida, and his team are using 700 tons of sand to make the creche. Pope John Paul II started the tradition of asking artisans to create a nativity scene every Advent, and the big reveal is Friday. Is anybody going to comment on the fact that we may have just seen Santa Claus making sand? All right, for all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter, Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.